Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Tom Millett and I'm a member of the New South Wales Ombudsman's Public Interest Disclosures Unit. We're joining you today from Gadigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, but also pay my respects and acknowledge the younger generation of First Nations peoples who will be the leaders and elders of the future. I realise we have people joining us from all over the state today, which is fantastic, so I also acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders for the lands that you're on today, and also welcome any Aboriginal people who are joining us for the session. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to everyone this afternoon about the role of managers and some of the considerations for managers under the Public Interest Disclosures Act. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome Kieran Gregory from the Public Service Commission here in New South Wales to talk to us a little bit. I've had the pleasure of working with Kieran for a number of years, and I know his experience and the wealth of knowledge that he brings to this topic. Kieran is a Principal Advisor in Integrity and Ethics at the Office of the Public Service Commissioner. Before joining that office, Kieran held a range of integrity and PID-focused roles at Ombudsman offices both here in New South Wales and also in Queensland. We're also very lucky that Kieran brings another set of skills to our discussion today, which is he's a long-time academic with the Queensland University of Technology with research interest focused on public sector integrity and whistleblowing. Most recently, and one of the reasons why it's so good to have Kieran with us today, he's been working on the development and implementation of the new whole-of-sector Code of Ethics and Conduct for the New South Wales government sector. So I'm really pleased to have Kieran with us. Before we hand over to him to make some opening remarks, just a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who've joined us for an earlier session, you'll know that the Q&A function is active. Anyone who hasn't, you'll see it there on your screen. Please feel free to send through any questions. A couple of staff from our team are keeping an eye on those. Some might be able to be answered very quickly and you'll get a response from the team. Others might be better for us to take offline and talk to you outside of the session, but if there are any that they feel are good to put through to the panel, they'll send them to us and we'll do our best to answer. Hopefully we have lots of questions. If we don't get to all of them today, we are pulling together some answers in the next couple of days, and we'll have something available at the end of the week for those who attended the session, but also anyone else who's been involved in the Awareness Week. So I'll hand over to Kieran now. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and over to you.
No worries. Thanks so much, Tom, and really appreciate the time that you've taken to run this PID Awareness Week. I think it's such a valuable opportunity to talk about such an important topic. I think it's worth reflecting on the role of managers in the first instance. So nobody has ever said that being a manager is easy. I think it's one of the more complex roles that people can have in the public sector. And if we think about the training that managers get as they move through their careers, so often we are starting as technicians and individual contributors. We then look at growing our career. All of a sudden we're then responsible for a number of people. And frequently as people move through their careers, they often are not getting the training and the exposure that they really need to be, really effective managers. So often there is a requirement for managers that they need to familiarise themselves with a whole range of different policies and processes. There's lots of stuff that we need to know. So that's the first thing. This stuff can be really tricky, but the role that we play as managers is really important. So we have a pivotal role to play, particularly in the wrongdoing space. There's really interesting research that says that for people who identify something that they think is a little bit off or a little bit dodgy, the first person that they're going to go to is their manager. And they're going to say, look, I think I've seen this. I don't really know, but I just wanted to test it out with you before I look at making a formal complaint or, making a formal disclosure or things like that. And so as managers, historically, we've not been somebody who could have received that disclosure usually. So under the previous Public Interest Disclosures Act, there were disclosure pathways that were often quite limited that were listed in organisational policies. So as managers, we had to be less attuned necessarily to those conversations, where our staff might be coming to us and saying, hey, look, there's something a little bit dodgy. Moving to the new world and under the new whistleblowing scheme, one of the really great innovations in the New South Wales PID legislation is that no wrongdoers approach. So for managers, for people who have people reporting through to them, we need to be really live to our staff coming to us and saying, look, I think I might have seen something. I just wanted to test it out with you. And we need to know that when our staff come to us, what to actually do with that information. Now, I know that in some parts of the government sector in New South Wales that's caused a little bit of consternation. And I think it's worth reflecting on the Queensland experience. So as Tom mentioned, before moving to the great state of New South Wales, I was working for the Queensland Ombudsman's office, and I was in a PID, I was in the PID unit up there. And for more than a decade, Queensland has had a similar approach to that of New South Wales, which is that no wrong doors approach, where people could go to their manager, make a public interest disclosure, and then the manager had the obligation to then say, well, okay, how do I funnel this through to the right pathway? And so part of the work that I used to do in Queensland was really working with people managers and supervisors and helping them understand, well, how do you pick up this information and then make sure that you're putting it through to the right process? So the advice that I used to give managers was this, and I'd encourage everyone to think about this as well. Your job is to really be aware of the kinds of conduct which would possibly be a public interest disclosure. That's the way that I used to think about it. You don't have to be an expert at the Act. I think that's really, really critical. We're not expecting every manager or every supervisor to be an absolute expert at analysing, and assessing public interest disclosures. But if your people are coming to you and if they're talking about the type of conduct which might be caught by the Act, then we need to have our antenna sharpened to the point that we can ask a couple of really, not calculated questions, but good questions, correct questions, in order to get enough information to then funnel it through. The other thing to think about is that often people will say, well, I reported it to my manager. So often people will say, well, I had a conversation with my manager, I've done my due diligence, and then we'll think that they've discharged their obligations. So if as managers, if our antenna isn't sharpened, and if the process stops there and if we're not passing it on, then that creates risk points. It means that the information may not be dealt with. Yeah. And fundamentally what we want is we want any allegations of wrongdoing or suspected wrongdoing to be assessed and then put through an appropriate process, because it's really obviously important that we don't have wrongdoing happening within the sector that we're not addressing and then dealing with.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, and it's something we've developed some e-learning and some resources as well for managers. And I think Kieran's point there is probably one of the key ones to bear in mind. It's not a manager's responsibility to assess. No. It's not a manager's responsibility to investigate or test. Correct. Something that someone said. It really is just being aware. And if anyone is on the meeting today who is in a managerial position but doesn't have a particularly good understanding of PID, it's important to get back to your agency and ask about how that training is available, how you can access either our training or some, as we've mentioned in other sessions, some agencies have developed their own tailored training in relation to public interest disclosures. But there is a legislative obligation for you to be trained around what your responsibilities are. Yeah. And that is so important to say. You don't need to make that assessment process. You need to know who to go to. Correct. So you need to know who your disclosure officers are. They'll be listed in your policy or you'll have them on your intranet. Yeah. So you can know who you can take a report to. Yeah. And I think, and it'd be really good to get your thoughts on this as well, I think one of the really important considerations is being mindful of the need to maintain the confidentiality of the person who's coming to you. Absolutely. And the information that they hold. Yeah,
look, that's exactly right. So what we know from the research and also what we know from practical experience as well is that before somebody goes to make a formal disclosure, often they'll be talking to different people in their agency just to reality test what they've seen. And you can understand why people do that, because these processes can seem really overwhelming and really daunting for people. They sound very, very formal. Obviously, we want to try and make them as risk-free and as stress-free for people as possible. We want to encourage people to come forward. We want to support them through these processes. But it's important to remember that people look at this stuff and they're like, oh, it looks like a big deal sometimes. And so creating a safe space where people can come and kind of test their ideas is something that I think is really important. But we also need to remember that loose lips sink ships. Yeah. And so it's really, really important that we're managing that confidentiality to the extent that we can. one of the interesting things that the research shows is that confidentiality is the most important protection. So, if we can lock this down, if we can reduce the number of people who are aware that a public interest disclosure has been made and that an investigation, if we choose to investigate, is on foot, then the more likely we are to manage risks of reprisal and detrimental action and things along those lines. And so confidentiality really, really critical. So that's why it's important that when you're talking to your teams to encourage them and say, look, if you see something, you should say something, but here are the ways that you can look at testing your ideas. Here's the ways that you can look at having conversations about this stuff, and come to me in the first instance in order to then talk that through. So,
I think it's really interesting when you say that, see something, say something. One of the points that the Ombudsman made in the panel conversation earlier in the week is that one of the substantial changes to the Act is there is now that centrality of culture.
Absolutely.
So rather than just a mechanical process or an obligation, it's talking about the importance of promoting a culture where public interest disclosures are not just handled, but they're encouraged.
Yes.
I'd be really interested from your research, but also from your current work around ethical conduct within the public sector. How do you see that sort of culture built?
Yeah.
And what are the effective ways of maintaining it over time?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really great question. So fundamentally, people are not going to come forward if they don't feel safe. So people are not going to come forward and raise issues if they don't think something is going to be done with the issue that they're raising. So there's a really interesting example from Queensland from a few years ago. It involved the investigation of Ipswich City Council by the Crime and Corruption Commission, which is the equivalent of ICAC in Queensland. And what they found is that this was a council which was just completely riven with wrongdoing, where there was corrupt conduct that was occurring at multiple levels of the organisation, where basically the entire senior executive, including the mayor, the chief executive, a number of senior executives, were engaged in what was ultimately some pretty dodgy stuff, and for many instances was ultimately criminal. And so as the CCC was working through this investigation, as they were interviewing people in the council, what they found was that people were not prepared to come forward because they didn't think that anything was going to happen with the issues that they raised. And when people did raise issues, they were either had impacts on their employment, their contracts were terminated, or they suffered some kind of other detrimental action. So there was no speak-up culture in Ipswich City Council. People were like, why would I bother? People just put their head down and then kind of kept going. And what it meant was that the wrongdoing was allowed to occur for much longer than it otherwise would have. So if we're thinking about, well, what can we do to create a speak-up culture? So it has to be modelled by managers, it has to be modelled by leaders. We need to be having conversations with our people on a regular basis and saying, here's our code of conduct. So the new code of conduct for the government sector has specific information in there about creating a speak-up culture, about the role of managers in creating a good ethical culture, and making sure that we're living our government sector core values of integrity, trust, accountability and service. So they sit at the heart of the government sector. So we need to be living and breathing that stuff. But in addition to that, we need to be making sure that we're encouraging people to come forward and just really reminding people, hey, look, you don't necessarily, you need that honest belief on reasonable grounds. So that's, something for people to have a think about. But you don't have to be right. You don't have to go and get all the evidence yourself. If you see something and if you think that there's an issue there, we want you to raise it with us because we'll assess it, we can investigate it, and then if we choose to investigate, and then make some decisions, around the outcome. But making sure that we're supporting people through these processes, that we're not hanging them out to dry. We are communicating in relation to outcomes to the extent that we can, noting, of course, the confidentiality provisions in the Act. All of that becomes really, really important. If people can see that wrongdoing is being dealt with, then they're more likely to come forward.
One of the things we've spoken when we do talk to agencies around this is it's that handling of matters that may not reach that threshold.
Absolutely.
So even if it's a small issue or something that doesn't necessarily reach the threshold of serious wrongdoing, showing that you will not only acknowledge that it's the right thing to do to come forward and raise it, but that we'll also look at it and we're actually serious about looking at it, I think is a really important message for all levels of managers to be communicating to their staff.
Yeah, look, I think that's exactly right. So, and the PID Act is set up to deal with the most serious allegations of wrongdoing, but it's not pit it or bin it. Like, it's not like, it's not like it's either a PID or it goes in the bin and we don't have a look at it. We've got multiple policies that we can use in order to deal with allegations of wrongdoing and processes for navigating that. And so it's important that people feel encouraged to come forward and know that we're going to support them when they go through those processes as well.
I think it's not PID or bin, it's going to stick around. That's definitely staying. I think that's a really important message to put across. I think it's also one of the challenges is if someone comes to their manager and raises concerns around something that may relate to particularly senior people within the organisation, I think it's also making sure that managers are aware that there are other avenues for that person to take. Do you want to talk a little bit about where they might go outside of their own organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that comes up quite well, every now and then this comes up. So people, people don't make these things up for the most part. So I think that's important to keep in mind from the beginning. So there's data from Queensland that suggests that for the public interest disclosures that are made in that state, on average, when they're investigated, around 2/3 of the time they're either substantiated or partially substantiated, which means around 1/3 of the time we're either not able to substantiate or it's unsubstantiated. So, the substantiation rates for these types of disclosures are generally pretty, people don't make these things up, is what I'm trying to say. And the number of investigations of people actually making these things up is really, really, really low. So people will often may feel afraid to come forward, particularly where it involves senior people within the organisation. And it's important that people know that they don't have to just make a PID within their organisation. So there's oversight agencies such as ICAC, such as the Ombudsman's office, such as the Audit Office of New South Wales. Depending on the type of wrongdoing that is being alleged, those kind of options are there. Now, people are able to go to members of Parliament in very specific circumstances. There's limited catch-alls for people going to journalists as well. And so it's just really important and really critical that people know the steps that need to have been followed before they look at some of those options.
Absolutely, and I think the other good addition to the new Act is that they can go to any integrity agency or any other agency to raise concerns. So that's probably something for managers who are working in circumstances where they're across various agencies. So if you've got a group operation that involves multiple government agencies, someone might come to you that you're supervising on a project and raise concerns, and just because they're not a member of your agency, or even if it's not a concern about your agency but the other one involved, there's still that opportunity for that information to be passed back. And Kieran spoke about the other avenues. One of the other additions you've got there now is that disclosures can be made to a minister's office or to a minister. The one thing to note, though, in that circumstance is that does need to be in writing. That's the only circumstance where it needs to be in writing. And that's probably an important point for us to mention too, is that someone doesn't need to go to their manager with an email or a written report of what they've seen. It can be part of a conversation that raises other issues. So you might be sitting down in a formal circumstance having a discussion around the work that you've got on hand. You could be standing in the tea room. It's just being aware of the fact that if someone raises those particular concerns that might be one of the categories of serious wrongdoing, you're alive to that, and that you're then thinking about how you can feed that information through to a disclosure officer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth observing as well. So there's research that occurred a couple of years ago. It's called the Whistling While They Work 2 research project, which I was a part of. I really encourage people to have a look at the outputs of that research. But one of the interesting findings from that research was that people often raise a public interest issue in conjunction with a personal interest issue. So you might have somebody who you're having a performance discussion with, for example, and then in the course of having that performance discussion, they also raise some issues around serious wrongdoing that they haven't raised previously. And there can be a tendency of some managers to dismiss some of those allegations and saying, oh, they're just raising it because they don't want to be performance managed or because they don't want this particular course of action to occur. The advice that we give agencies is that they're two separate things. So you separate them out, and it's like, okay, well, this particular, issue that they've raised in relation to the wrongdoing, we, deal with that separately. We put it through its own process, depending on what our internal policies and procedures say, and we deal with that separately. So one of the key things for us to be aware of is, well, how do we look at separating these things out and making sure that we're dealing with things individually, as opposed to that kind of conglomerated mess and letting things get confused. Now, you don't have to be experts at this. Managers do not have to be experts at this stuff. There's internal supports that are available, and you should have a look at your policy instruments and understand who you can talk to internally in order to kind of tease these things out and then think about what direction they should go in.
Absolutely. And I think just to Kieran reminded me, because you did mention the excellent Whistling While They Work research, and Kieran, along with research partners like AJ Brown and Jane Olsen, have done an incredible job pulling together that body of research, and it's probably one of the preeminent bodies of research around whistleblowing, certainly in Australia, but globally as well.
Absolutely.
One of the things that came out of that as well, which builds on your point about the 2/3 being substantiated or partially substantiated, is that survey that formed part of the second round of research found that line managers, governance and audit professionals, but also senior leaders, all recognised internal reports as being the most effective way to identify something going on wrong within their organisation. So I think that's a really important point to make, is that it's not ancillary, it's not part of it. They all see it as an important method of bringing things to light. And that sits alongside the audit officer's survey results, which is much more of a concrete number, but when they looked at the best way of identifying fraud in the public sector, it was tip-offs.
Yeah, absolutely.
And while they didn't differentiate between tip-offs from public officials and outside, I think everyone who's on the session today would recognise the person most likely to see when something is wrong and have an understanding that something's not operating how it should is the person sitting next to whoever it may be, or the person working in the same line group. And that's the Chief Commissioner of the ICAC made that point very clearly in his conversation during the panel session, is that that's one of their key sources of information, is people that sit within agencies and see something that's not quite right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, and I think that's really important for us to remember. It's also important for us to remember that people, and this is something that can get a little bit tricky for managers as well, is that we might have perceptions of people in our team as being a bit of an agitator or a bit of a troublemaker, or somebody, who makes complaints or lodges grievances at the drop of a hat. And there can be a little bit tendency, and I've observed this in different organisations, for people to just dismiss some of those perceived agitators or troublemakers and the issues that they're raising. And it's really important to separate the allegation from our perceptions of the person who is raising that. So that can also just be a bit of a risk point, just building on what you said there. We should be looking at the information itself and assessing that on a case-by-case basis, and then reflecting on, okay, well, what should we do? And again, as managers, it's just about knowing who to funnel that through to, and then have that go through an assessment process.
And I think that is one of the really challenging aspects, is to disconnect that from your day-to-day experience with people, is realise, yes, I may be dealing with something else. And you spoke about the fact there can be a personnel issue that you're dealing with at the same time, but recognise that and go, no, this is dealt with under a different process, as it should be. And that's one of the interesting changes to the Act too, is that inclusion of a provision around reasonable management action. To make sure that if you are taking action that doesn't link directly to the making of the public interest disclosure, that can either begin or continue throughout that process. So I think that was a really important addition in the Act as well.
I completely agree. So, and that provision has been in the Queensland legislation for some time. Really, really important, because some people will reflect on, oh, well, if I make a public interest disclosure at this point, that will cease all of the management action which I'm currently being subjected to. And I mentioned earlier about separating things out into different processes and then continuing. The important thing is that we've also got records supporting why we're doing what we're doing. Absolutely. So, if this is going to end up in the Commission, or if it's going to end up with an oversight agency or through any other kind of review process, really critical that we've got contemporaneous records supporting why we're doing what we're doing, just to make sure that we, are able to support the course of action that we're taking.
Yeah, absolutely. We've spoken about that role as an avenue of disclosure, But there's probably another point that it'd be good to get your views on, which is as someone moves through, if they've made a voluntary public interest disclosure, it can be quite, even with the best systems, it can be quite a stressful experience.
Yeah.
And there may well still be a role for those line managers to provide that day-to-day support.
Absolutely.
And be interesting to see how you see that operating, or if you've got any thoughts about how that works in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently undertaking a PhD, and one of the things that I'm looking at is the procedural harms that are linked to people making public interest disclosures. And what I mean by that is somebody either makes a public interest disclosure or, in the alternative, is alleged to have engaged in wrongdoing as a result of a PID being made. Once the assessment happens, if the decision is made to investigate, these can be quite protracted, stressful processes. They can go on for a comparatively long time. When people are involved in these processes, we tell them, shush. It's like you shouldn't be talking to anyone because confidentiality is the most important protection, and the more people talk, the more likely it is that that is to be breached, and then detrimental action may ensue. So we tell people you've got to be quiet, you can't talk to anyone, and this is an investigation that may go on for a reasonably lengthy time. If you're accused of doing the wrong thing, you might also be removed from the workplace while that investigation is tested, potentially, and while that allegation is tested. And that, again, you know, in Queensland, there's evidence of some investigations taking over 12 months. So 12 months, 18 months, 2 years. Long time for people to be living with this stress and then thinking about the consequences of that. So there are significant procedural harms and that could ensue as a result of a process which is completely legitimate and that we need to undertake to test the allegation of wrongdoing. So regular communication with the parties involved, you know, checking in and supporting people, all of that becomes really important. And depending on how your agency has chosen to structure support arrangements, you as your line manager or you as their supervisor might be called upon to provide that support and to check in and just say, look, how are you going? And, you know, talk about, you know, how you're feeling and what can we do to help support you and things along those lines. Now, that's a really, really tricky role to play. And there's a lot of work happening in Australia and in different jurisdictions as well, looking at the role of whistleblower support. I think it's also important not to forget our subject officers as well, because if we come back to the figures that I gave earlier, around a third of the time, in Queensland anyway, we're not able to establish that the subject officer has done anything wrong. Yeah. And so if we're then looking at bringing them back into the organisation after they've been out for a period of time, you know, there's huge harms that can be linked there. So it's something that we need to be really live to as we move through these processes. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, well, I might just jump. We've got a couple of excellent questions coming through from attendees. I might jump to a couple of these and we can have a bit of a chat about those. The first one there is asking, should managers be the one doing the risk assessment for PIDs rather than the disclosure officer? I think the short answer to that would be no. It may well be that managers have an involvement in informing that risk assessment because they understand the workplace. So they know the people, they know the parties, they know the history. Yeah. But I think it is really important to stress, unless they are a disclosure officer and that is a core responsibility in their agency's policy or procedures, it's not something that should be sitting with them at that stage. Is that
I think that's fair, absolutely. So managers will have good intel that will often inform that risk assessment, as you say, because the risks will vary depending on who's involved, the work patterns, the power imbalance between the parties as well. So all of that can play into the assessment of risk, but it's up to each agency to decide how all of that is structured, but I would tend to agree with you that managers generally should not be doing that in and of themselves. Yeah.
And just to build, because I know there's a lot of people attending this session who haven't necessarily been to some of the others, but in the disclosure officer session we discussed the fact that a risk assessment isn't a set and forget.
No, correct.
That you have to, that has to remain live, and there may be stages at which managers have conversations with whoever's responsible for managing that risk assessment around what's changed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we know that there are key points where the risk tends to increase, and that can include when the investigation is about to be commenced, if we're commencing an investigation, after the disclosure has been made, obviously, at the point where we're looking at interviewing, and then also when we're looking at deciding on an outcome and are about to issue letters. So those are key points in investigations where risk may increase, and so they're good points from my point of view in order to really review that risk assessment and just make sure that it is still adequate. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, we've got a couple more coming through. There's a question there which goes across the scheme itself, and I think we can both talk to this one, but I'll hand to you first, is what option does an agency have if they choose not to investigate themselves? Who can they refer it to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, there's some really good options that are available there, and it's important to, I think, have really good conversations, not only with the Ombudsman's office, but also with ICAC if it involves corrupt conduct, with the Auditor Office as well, and keep those channels with those oversight agencies open around the preferred path forward. So, and you would be better positioned to talk about if a PID was made directly to the Ombudsman, then it was referred off to the agency if the agency chose not to investigate it themselves, what the course of action might be there.
Look, I think in that circumstance there would be a conversation with our office around how and why that's happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's also that opportunity for the person who made the disclosure to then come through to our office. If an investigation is ceased or there's a decision not to investigate, they can come through to us and raise those concerns.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting too that those are some of the areas where we're required to receive notifications, which will start to build, and Kieran mentioned that knowledge base that's available in Queensland. There's a series of, and agencies are going through their annual return process at the moment, but there's also notifications throughout the year that can start to build that picture, not only of how many there are and where they are, but what they're about and how they're handled. So I think that's a really important part of the new legislative scheme, is that we can start to build that better picture, which can inform not only where resources and effort go from our point of view, but also where those supports and assistance might be needed across the public sector. So I think that's one of the advantages to pulling together that data source.
I think so. So Queensland is, in some ways, quite a far way ahead of New South Wales in terms of the amount of data that it's been collecting for more than a decade in this space. And I would go out to different councils and to different agencies in regional Queensland, and I'd be talking to people, and I'd have people come to me, so chief executives of councils come to me and say, proud as punch, we've never had a PID. In a decade we've never had a PID, isn't that great? And that was one of our red flags when we were looking at doing auditing and monitoring work, agencies that had never received one, so which might be true, but then the question is, well, do you have the systems and the structures in place to pick these things up? Noting the breadth of kind of conduct which is caught by the Public Interest Disclosure Act, particularly in Queensland. So I think once we start to get a really good picture of the data in New South Wales, it will give us a good opportunity to understand where potential risk points are and where the Ombudsman should be dedicating their energies in terms of training and capability uplift.
Absolutely. And I think that's similar to the messaging. We've certainly had it around public interest disclosures under the old Act, but also in relation to complaints is PIDs and complaints aren't a bad thing.
No, they're not.
Complaints show that members of the public have a confidence in speaking up and raising their concerns, and PIDs are the same. So we talked about that cultural element before. If people are willing to speak up and willing to raise concerns, they may only have a small part of the picture.
Correct.
And you may be able to go back to them and go, look, you can see that, but in fact that forms part of a broader process, or that's a perfectly legitimate thing that's taken place. But it's good that when they had that unease, they were willing to speak up and willing to raise those concerns.
That's exactly right. And we really need to be encouraging our people to do that. We certainly don't want to be discouraging people from raising those concerns, because, as I said, that Ipswich City Council example, I think, is really, really instructive of what happens where people don't feel comfortable coming forward. Absolutely. And there are plenty of examples at the federal level and in New South Wales where that has occurred as well.
We've got another question that's come through, which is a really good one to raise for this panel. If someone's already revealed, and we sort of touched on it briefly before, but it'd be good to unpack it a bit more, revealed their identity by reporting to their team in an open environment about corrupt conduct that they think might be occurring, and their identity can't be protected, how would they, the question is asked, how would they be covered? But it's really, how would they be protected from detrimental action?
Yeah, absolutely. So while I mentioned confidentiality is the most important protection, and we really need to be encouraging our people that if they are making a disclosure, that they really should not be disclosing that to their identity to other people. It's obviously not the only protection in the Act, and those protections around detrimental action, they absolutely still exist. It just becomes a little bit trickier. The risk of detrimental action, I should say, increases where confidentiality is broken. So we as agencies and as managers can take steps in order to make sure that that doesn't happen through the provision of support, through checking in with people, through reminding not only the people who are alleged to have engaged in wrongdoing, but also our teams more broadly around the consequences of engaging in detrimental action, even if somebody has revealed their identity. So that's important, I think, for us to remember.
And I think that's one of the important aspects of the Act too, is that it's not a blanket requirement to maintain confidentiality. It recognises that exact scenario that someone's provided, is that it's readily known or known more widely, and it's not able to maintain. You're not able to maintain the confidence of the person or the information, and then it is really about, and you know, we could probably a whole other day of conversation, but really about those options around how you do provide that protection and support from detrimental action. And in some cases, it might be a direct conversation with a business unit or a work unit. If everyone knows and everyone knows what's going on, then that might be one of the options. I'd probably say if that is beyond a hypothetical for someone, it might be worth getting in contact with our advice team and talking to them a little bit further. And if anyone is in that scenario and they're not sure, do reach out to our office and ask for that advice and assistance. And we might be able to provide some direction around some options you may have.
Definitely. It's also important to remind everyone of their obligations under the Code of Conduct. So we have a new mandatory Code of Ethics and Conduct that is coming into effect for government sector employees from the 1st of November. But up until that point, you know, there's still codes of conduct that apply, and there are provisions in there in relation to people not engaging in the kind of conduct that you're talking about. So, you know, making sure that people are mindful of what they're saying in the workplace and being respectful and things along those lines. So, and also, you know, reminding people that just because they're engaging in conduct outside of work and they're not in the workplace, you know, if they're still breaching the Code of Conduct and it's linked to them making, it's linked to a public interest disclosure that's been made, you know, important to keep that in mind as well, that the Code and the PID Acts extend beyond just being at work.
Fantastic. We've got a question through in relation to who would be the manager for a contractor working under the Act and how that would work in practice. I think in a lot of cases this is where you're looking at your less direct managerial responsibilities. So if you're linking in there, you're looking at people who have a supervisory responsibility, and that may well be someone within the agency who's then responsible for the work that a contractor's performing. So then that contractor can come through and talk to the manager or supervisor and raise their concerns that way.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember the intent of the Act. It's that no wrong doors approach. So we want to have as many doors open as possible, so we're catching these, you know, allegations when they're coming through, so we can put them through an assessment process and test them. One of the weaknesses of the previous scheme was that people had to find the right door. And by the time they, you know, knocked on enough doors in order to find the right one, often they'd spoken to a whole bunch of people, breached that confidentiality, everyone knew it was them, and then the risk of detrimental action was significantly increased. There were poorer outcomes that were linked to that. So it's important to just keep in mind the intent of the Act and the objects of the Act, which is we want to have that catch-all so that where there are these allegations, and, you know, a contractor is equally as likely to see dodgy behaviour as somebody who is employed under the Government Sector Employment Act, for example, so who's in ongoing or fixed-term employment. And everyone should be protected, really, right?
And I think that's probably a good point also to talk about. We had the discussion around contractors this morning, and one of the things we were talking about is that it is that providing services on behalf of the agency. But even if someone doesn't necessarily fall within that definition, the agency still has the capacity to deem a matter to be a public interest disclosure. So that's a decision by the head of agency that even if they don't meet those particular criteria, and in this case it may be that they don't meet the definition of a public official, their circumstance and the risk of detrimental action that arises for them may well mean that the agency decides, well, you don't tick all the boxes, but we still believe that you need the protections provided by the PID Act, and we're deeming this matter to be a public interest disclosure.
That's exactly right. So, and that's an important point, I think, to continue to come back to. You know, this Act wasn't designed to be this huge administrative burden that we shoehorn every single complaint into. So it's important for us to reflect on, well, what is it trying to achieve, and where there are those risks and people who are, you know, seriously at risk of detrimental action or, kind of consequences for coming forward, that we are putting in place structures to protect them, so that they're legally, but also that we're taking steps to protect them at a really practical level as well.
Fantastic. We've got a question here around what happens if a manager doesn't pass on a disclosure?
Yeah, that's a great question.
It is a good question. I think probably the simplest answer is that you're placing that person at risk, and you're also not ensuring that the organisation's effectively managing the concerns that are raised with it.
Yeah. Fundamentally, when our people come to us, they're giving us an opportunity to do something with the information that they're providing. They're giving us an opportunity to have a look at the concerns that they're raising and then deal with them. So it comes back to the point that I made earlier, is that sometimes that might be the only opportunity the agency has to deal with the allegation of wrongdoing. Because the person who's come to you as their manager might think, well, I've done my duty, job done. And so if we're not passing that on, we're not only depriving the agency of the opportunity to assess and potentially deal with the allegation, but there could potentially be code of conduct implications as well if we're sitting on that information, if we knew about it and then the wrongdoing continues to occur. So it's important for us to have a good understanding of our obligations, not only under the PID Act, but also under our Code of Ethics and Conduct for our agency, and then also understand what our obligations are under our policy framework as well.
I think it's important to recognise too that the Act does require a manager, if someone comes to them and says and talks to them about it, there is an obligation for them to commit that to writing.
Absolutely.
And then there is that obligation for them to then refer it on to a disclosure officer, at which point, to use a glib term, the clock starts running. But that's when the agency is considered to have received, is when that comes through. So managers do have that obligation to make sure that it passes on. It may be no more than that, but they need to make sure that it makes that transition.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, I have worked in a number of different organisations, and I've had staff come to me before where, they've just blurted out allegations of quite serious corrupt conduct that I've had statutory obligations to then pass on through the process, and I've had staff who've been quite unhappy with me for having to do that. Part of what I try and do as a manager is I try to create a culture where people know that they can come to me and talk to me about allegations of wrongdoing, or they can come and talk to me about things that they think that they've seen, but they know that then I've got responsibilities, and not only responsibilities, but also what I feel is a personal duty in order to then, make sure that that's dealt with effectively. We're not priests. This isn't confession. People are not able to, come to us and kind of download, really serious information and then expect that nothing is going to happen. So people need to be aware that we all should want to work for organisations that are free from wrongdoing. We work for the public sector. We work for the people of New South Wales, and we should want to make sure that we've got, good organisations where if things are going a little bit wobbly, that we're looking into it and then dealing with it. I think that's fundamental.
Absolutely. And this probably builds on that point. Someone's asked if a manager can opt out of this responsibility. I think the short answer is no. The Act makes it very clear that if you have that direct or indirect managerial responsibility, then you are obligated to receive and to make sure they're referred appropriately.
That's exactly right. So we're almost like a post box. We're a post office. We're just passing it on. So, but no, and we shouldn't want to opt out of it either, I think is important for us to remember. So, as managers and supervisors, as leaders for our people, we should want to create a culture and an environment where people feel comfortable coming to us and then we know what to do with it. So it's important to look at these things as in that really kind of positive light. I think this isn't a compliance exercise to my mind. It's about creating cultures where we can all feel comfortable and proud to work.
Fantastic, thank you. There's a more general question here, but a really important one to talk to, asking if an anonymous reporter can make a public interest disclosure. Again, the short answer is yes, but I'll hand over to you to talk for a minute about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So often, so with anonymous disclosure, so let me take a step back. So there was an example. I'll use again Queensland because I think it's fun to talk about the great state of Queensland. So in Queensland there was a local council where they received an anonymous disclosure. So one of their staff members wrote to the chief executive. They set up an anonymous email address. So they set up an anonymous Gmail. They wrote to the CEO and they said, "Here's all this dodgy stuff that is happening." And the chief executive officer spent more time trying to find out who that anonymous person was who'd set up that email address than dealing with the allegation of wrongdoing. People, which is obviously problematic. People may not feel comfortable putting their name to a public interest disclosure straight away. They may not feel super comfortable with the culture. They may not have confidence that it's going to be dealt with effectively. And so it's not uncommon for people to do exactly what I just said and set up an email address and write to the agency, give all of this information. And what you'll often find is that when there's that back and forth and, people get more confident in the process, often they will come forward and they'll say, actually, this person is me. But they may not. Yep. The problem with, not the problem, but the challenge with anonymous disclosures is that when it's an anonymous disclosure, it's trickier for us to implement the protections. So that's just something to keep in mind. But what I would encourage people to do is set up email addresses so they can at least correspond, with the agency and get updates on what's happening and be aware of their protections and things along those lines, even if on a practical level it's more difficult to protect somebody who is making an anonymous disclosure.
And I'm sure it's true across all jurisdictions, but we've seen in New South Wales, certainly since the implementation of the new Act, is a lot of larger agencies have actually established a hotline service, which allows people to come forward and report, and they can report a range of other conduct through that as well.
Absolutely.
But it allows them to have a unique identifier when they come in. They can't be traced back, but then you can, because one of the biggest challenges is when you need to make those follow-up inquiries, you need to ask additional questions as you're assessing a matter and also as you're handling a matter. And they're starting to use those portals as an effective way for people to have that communication.
Absolutely. So where it can get complicated and where we need to be really mindful as agencies is where the information that somebody has disclosed, even if anonymously, there's only a couple of people who might be across that. And we have seen examples in other jurisdictions where people start to make leaps of faith and they start to think, well, you're one of 3 people who have had access to this information, so we think you made this anonymous disclosure, so we're going to go after you and, take detrimental action against you. And that's obviously really, problematic. So that's just a risk point I think it's important to be remembering. People are doing us a favour by coming forward. We shouldn't be trying to immediately figure out who is making these disclosures. We need to look at the information on its face and then assess and deal with it.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note too that the Act does provide those protections against detrimental action if it's taken because the person's made a PID or the person is suspected to have made a PID. So that catches that scattergun or you're going down the wrong path to make sure that those protections still apply to the person. And that might be the point where someone decides to come forward, is when they start to feel something like that happening or they feel that there is some form of detriment as a result of someone within their business unit speaking up.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Great. Thank you. There's a question here around whether a manager has an obligation to consult with their one-up in the line before reporting to a disclosure officer.
Yeah, look, this is a good question. And I've seen examples in other agencies where where the chief executive has mandated that before something is referred to a disclosure officer, it makes its way through the chain up to them. And I think we need to reflect on the risk points that the more people who are aware of a potential disclosure, the greater the risk of confidentiality breaches. So, the advice that I've historically given agencies is that we want to try and reduce that chain as much as we possibly can. Reduce the number of people who are aware of the potential disclosure because that then manages the confidentiality risks to the extent practical.
And I think also the other way around that is you have your disclosures officers effectively spread across your organisation. So someone isn't jumping 4 lines in their management chain in order to get to a DO.
Correct.
They've got someone who they have had some form of professional relationship with or know that they can then approach as a disclosure officer. So it doesn't have to go through multiple sets of hands.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, I guess the other thing is, often there'll be reporting that will go through to audit and risk committees or to senior leadership teams in relation to allegations of the types of wrongdoing that are being alleged and things along those lines. So it's just important that if those reporting regimes are in place, that you are minimising the amount of information that is being fed through. People don't need to know who's made a complaint or who's made a disclosure, but they might need to know that the type of information being disclosed or, the number of investigations on foot and things along those lines. But again, it's about that risk of confidentiality and breaches of confidentiality and then managing that accordingly.
Fantastic. Questions come through is, as a manager, once I've informed the disclosure officer of the information, is my job done? I think we've talked a little bit about this earlier, but it depends on the circumstance. So if there is that need for ongoing support and assistance to the person, you may well have an ongoing role. If there is a need to monitor the risk of detrimental action, then you may have that contact with someone within the organisation. Or if the person has someone they want to trust, someone they trust who they can talk to. That may well be you.
Yep.
So I think it depends on the circumstance. Your statutory responsibility is fulfilled, but your organisational, and this is probably where those code of conduct obligations sit as well, your organisational responsibility might continue. So it's worth talking to whoever that contact is, so the disclosure officer or whoever has responsibility for carriage of the matter, to find out if there's anything more you can or should be doing.
That's exactly right, yeah. So when I was working in Queensland, we used to do a lot of work with agencies around, okay, well, what does your support arrangements actually look like? Are you going to have a team set up of support officers that provide support right across the organisation? Or in the alternative, are you going to educate and train managers when a disclosure is made around how to provide that support? And I think it's worth observing that unless the manager is involved in the wrongdoing, that's the relationship that the person has in the relationship. You're the person that people are most likely to come to. You are often best positioned to provide that support and check in, and also monitor for risks of detrimental action and things along those lines. So, you know, it's, as I said at the beginning, it's not easy being a manager.
And I think it's important to recognise too that you should make sure you have the supports in place, because it can also be a stressful experience for you as a manager to deal with that circumstance in a business unit.
Absolutely.
So make sure that you've got those connections and those supports, and that you can fulfil your responsibility without having any detrimental impact on yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's employee assistance programs and there's other programs that people can access. But, you know, one of the most complex examples I've seen in my career was where a manager, there were two of their staff had made the public interest disclosure. The other three staff members were alleged to have engaged in the wrongdoing. So they had a team of 5, and it almost became like West Side Story between the us and them kind of thing. And very, very complex for that manager to then look after those people. And so that's where it's important to then talk to your organisation around, well, what are we going to do in order to make sure that we're looking after everybody involved? And do we need to look at reassigning reporting lines and moving people out of work environments and things along those lines? Noting, of course, that people can perceive decisions to move them as being detrimental action in and of themselves, so that can get quite complex.
Yep. And I think that's where having those conversations with the unit or staff members responsible for handling the disclosure is really important. So again, that probably is where your job may not be done. But that's also where you may have those supports and assistance you need to perform that work effectively.
Exactly. So, and I really think it is worth reinforcing, you know, the really great role that the New South Wales Ombudsman's Office plays in this space. So, you know, there's a PID team who's responsible for bringing this act to life and for putting in place those supports and helping us do this really, really well. And I know from personal experience, I used to work here, they don't want you to be a stranger. They really do want agencies to pick up the phone and talk this stuff out, so they can help make sure that we're getting good outcomes for everybody involved.
Absolutely, and we've spoken a lot about the advice function over the last couple of days, but there is also that if you're unsure and you just need to talk to someone, there is that opportunity to contact us and have those conversations at an early stage.
That's exactly it. So, and you know, Tom, I'm sure you can build on this, but from my experience, they won't tell you what to do, but they'll certainly help you talk through, here are the considerations, here are the factors, and then, you know, help you make the decision.
Absolutely. One thing we've been saying a lot, not just this week, but going back to when the Act first commenced and beforehand, is we can't tell you what to do. We can't give you legal advice, but we can certainly provide as much assistance and guidance as we can to help you to manage the situation. In some circumstances, and this is certainly true with a lot of the interactions we've had since the Act commenced, is we may say to you, you need to seek your own legal advice as an agency on how best to handle that. But we can also, I mean, the team's looking at those sort of issues day in, day out. So while a lot of things are unique, there'll be others that aren't. So they might have dealt with a similar inquiry, and people have different knowledge and understanding around the Act itself.
Absolutely.
So someone might have been a disclosure coordinator under the 94 Act. They've transitioned across, they're very sure how to deal with the matters they have, but they have a particular issue they want to ask about. But at the same time, there is so much movement and fluidity in the public sector that people will come into roles, and particularly managers, that, as you said, you move into a management role often from a line responsibility, and all of a sudden this is an extra thing that you need to get your head around. So talking to us can be a really good way to help help you to do that.
Yeah.
And accessing that training is really important.
That's exactly right. So there's lots and lots of supports there. And I also think that, as the Act is in place for a longer period of time, we'll get more case law and more precedent from the different courts in terms of interpreting different provisions. In Queensland, we're now seeing, quite a lot of case law being generated linked to the PID Act, and that's after around a decade or so of that being of that Act being in effect. So, that will also help in terms of getting some consistency across the sector. Yeah. But critically, we just need to have records. So I think just having really clear records supporting why decisions are being made and tracking, how matters are being dealt with and the actions that you're taking. In the absence of records, it gets very, very difficult for people coming in after the fact to understand what's been going on. So that record keeping, it's the number one recommendation in investigations by integrity agencies. And so it's just important to reinforce that here as well.
Well, I can't think of a better message for us to end on than the importance of full and adequate records. Thank you, Kieran, so much. It's been fantastic to have you here today, not only sharing your experience in your current role, your work with 2 Ombudsman offices, but also the wealth of your academic research in this area. I wish you all the best of luck with your PhD.
Wonderful.
And thank you, everyone, for taking part. My last message would be, if you are in a management role and you haven't had that opportunity to access training materials, talk to your agency, talk to your line manager, or talk to those responsible for the public interest disclosures responsibilities in your agency, and find out how you can access that training. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great afternoon.